Hey samplers, this is your host Katherine Grant. While I am on summer vacation, I decided to round up some of the story samples from our previous podcasts for you to enjoy. In this episode, please enjoy two story samples from the Georgian era. First, For a Scot's Heart Only by Gina Conkle, followed by The Forger and the Duke by Misty Urban. Don't forget to subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler so you get fresh episodes in your feed every week, including our next brand new episode on August 7th with best-selling author Elizabeth Everett. Happy listening!
Oh, I am going to read from my book, For a Scot's Heart Only. It's the third book in the Scottish novels. This is, if I may, this is the first one, and this is the second one. And the premise of the series is it's 7 years after Culloden, and a band of Scotswomen go to London to hunt the lost treasure of Archaic. So like the scene set up on this one, For a Scot's Heart Only, is Thomas is a shipbuilder and shipmaster, and he's had a mild flirtation with Mary in the past, and they do business together because he sells her whale bones and baleen. And he is shocked to find her in a brothel in Maison Bedwell in the middle of the night. And so the scene setup is he's escorting her out when they have a most surprising conversation. So here we go. As they reached the entry hall, nearly a dozen noblemen poured into Maison Bedwell, rain spitting at their backsides. They paid the attendant and began shedding greatcoats and hats into the arms of waiting footmen. Miss Fletcher broke away from Thomas and folded her fan, the very polite and very icy version of her, back in place. Thank you, Mr. West. Your assistance was invaluable. It was my pleasure. The Scotswoman was distracted, drifting toward newcomers. Had he been dismissed? Arms crossed, he waited. She circled the crowd, searching for someone. He'd keep her in sight, but he wouldn't follow. Pride, certainly, and he had fair knowledge of her. Miss Fletcher might look like a confection in white silk, but her beauty came with a bite. London's whaling trade was small, and the corset maker had a reputation for being cool and headstrong. She had to be. The business of corsets and stays was largely the province of men, which gave him pause. Miss Fletcher might have come here with a man. He rested a shoulder on the wall. Competition was inevitable. He'd wait and see who it was. The men in the entry were gaping at her, their heads whipping left to right when she passed by. Fools, he said under his breath. They missed the better part of her, the calluses and scars on her fingers, her blunt nails and red knuckles. Their quizzical glances were an attempt to size her up. He pitied them. Miss Fletcher wasn't of their ilk. Her gait too brisk, her gaze too direct, and her nature too focused. Their way of life would bore her to tears, which begged the question, why was she here? His jaw had nearly unhinged when he'd spied her across the gaming room. He'd left a promising game of hazard to see what she was about. The conversation which followed, illuminating. Miss Fletcher was an enigma, her skin pearlescent under chandeliers, her lips lush and pillowy. The other pillowy parts on full display had stunned him, such largesse considering the corset maker was usually prim and proper. A footman stopped to speak to her, pointing at the front door. She bestowed a smile on him, and the sod practically melted on the spot, yet Miss Fletcher was not a purposeful seductress. She seemed not to care about her effect on men, all but ignoring the newcomers. Her polite rebuffs sent that gaggle of men to the ballroom. Revelry dimmed when a footman shut the ballroom doors behind them. Finally, some peace and quiet. Miss Fletcher waited in the heart of the room, her head and neck craning at the ceiling. Rather deceptive, she muttered. Thomas looked up. Frescoes covered the high-arched entry. What's deceptive? Her chin dropped. You're still here, she said, mildly surprised. Where else would I be? I did say I'd see you safely out. A gentle smile creased her lips. What an honorable man you are, Mr. West, but that's not necessary. She stayed put. He did the same, his shoulders stuck to the wall. So that's how she's going to play it. Despite their extraordinary night, Miss Fletcher wanted to put them both back on the neat shelf of merchant and shopkeeper, as if this interlude never happened. He wasn't having it. What's wrong with the frescoes? He asked. She waved vaguely at the vaulted ceiling, each section a vignette. You don't see it? Nude women lolling on the grass, nude women laughing on swings, and nude women riding on. She huffed and grumbled. Never mind, when a servant delivered her cloak. Please, Thomas said, do go on. The Scotswoman whirled black velvet over her shoulders. I really must go. My friend is waiting for me. Friend, is it? But you haven't finished. He pointed at the frescoes. We are in a brothel, Miss Fletcher. Unclothed women are part of the transaction. Gleaming beads encircled knowing eyes while she tied a bow under her chin. Indeed, we are in a brothel, but those painted women are an overly cheerful lot. Why wouldn't they be? Their cheer is the deceit, she said. Then it's not their nakedness which bothers you. It's their demeanor. Miss Fletcher was migrating closer to him. Her bow finished, a small frown showed above it. He grinned, delighted at having ruffled her feathers. Have I struck an uncomfortable note? He asked. Not quite. He canted his head. Explain yourself. Miss Fletcher studied him as if she played a bigger conversational game and he the unwitting opponent. It is not an appropriate topic of conversation. What about our conversation in the gaming room? He goaded. Was that appropriate? She rewarded him with an amiable smile. Fair logic, Mr. West, but I am trying to be delicate. I don't need delicate. Oh, that's right, she said, drawing near. You have a taste for forthrightness. Most men do. The Scotswoman pinned him with an artful gaze. Then you'll appreciate my indelicate summation that you, like most men, think the sun rises and sets on your John Thomas. He grunted. What a saucy piece. With black velvet draping luscious curves, she made an enchanting picture until her pretty mouth spilled more sacrilege. And like most men, you believe women bask in the glory of your virility. The truth is, most women do not. He tried to be casual, arms crossed and all. Never had a woman complain. Miss Fletcher hooked a finger through a buttonhole on his coat, and a carnal earthquake rocked him. Oh, I'm sure the stars shimmered and the moon shined brighter, she said, teasingly soft. A grin broke despite an effort to quash it. Never said I inspired poetry. Her answering smile told him he'd brought a pistol to a cannon fight. I tried to warn you. Her gentle tug on his coat ran a plumb line hot and fast south of his navel. Bloody hell, this woman would make a monk cry. He was mildly affronted, highly curious, and vexingly aroused. A strange effect. The Scotswoman dissembled him, piece by piece. Yet the more she talked, the more transfixed he was by her and her genteel Edinburgh accent. There was an educated back-of-the-mouth treatment Miss Fletcher gave to her words. Definitely a voice to warm his cockles on a cold winter's night. This was a first, a woman's voice inciting lust. What was next? Worshipping her knees? You sound confident, he said, a touch surly. Her shrug slight, Miss Fletcher let go of his coat. I am. As the only female corset and stays maker in London, women confide in me. Lots of women. And I found their stories remarkably similar. He shifted off the wall, missing her hand on his coat. What do they say? Noise burst from the ballroom. A doe-eyed harlot and a barrel-chested man, his cravat fluttering loose, draped through the entry. A footman scurried from the shadows and shut the ballroom's gilt-trimmed doors as though he could dam revelry's tide. Miss Fletcher watched the footman, raising her hood and hiding her glorious hair. Every day women come and go to my shop. None of them have any idea what others have told me. But mark me, sir, they're honest. About half the women tell me they feign enthusiasm in bed, while others confess to lying limp as yesterday's fish. The number who do find pleasure in the act is quite small, I'm afraid. He could feel a scowl growing. You're telling me most women in London find no pleasure in bed sport? Her answer was a long-suffering exhale. You're a smart man, Mr. West. Do the math. Most of the wives who visit my shop say it's their marital duty. She eyed the frescoes, almost bored. You and I both know for harlots, it's a job. He glanced at the painted ceiling, irritated. Those frolicking women, their smiles were overbright. What about your pleasure? He asked. The gruff question popped out. It bordered on too much. But this was an evening of excess. Miss Fletcher merely brushed back a blasted curl which kept falling on her cheek. I really must go, she said. My friend is waiting. He tensed like a predator. Your friend? She started walking backward, confident. There'd be no more womanly secrets and no utterance on who waited for her. Promise me you will forget this night, was her request. Our flirtation? He advanced on her. Not a chance. Her silk petticoats shushed prettily. It cannot happen again, she said. Why not? The footman in pink and white livery whisked open the front door, doing his best to blend in the woodwork. The rain had stopped, a dense mist replacing it. Miss Fletcher swept into the night, and he joined her on the front step. Please don't follow me, she said. You don't want me to see you safely to your carriage? I'm a capable woman, Mr. West. I've spent years seeing myself in and out of carriages. Therein was the problem. The corset maker didn't need a man. Years of good breeding and gentlemanly fiber demanded that he see her safely away. He searched the damp square for clues as to where she was going. Candle lamps hung from trees in the center garden. Carriages clustered the road outside. Outside Maison Bedwell, their lamps chips of light. Cloaked in black, Miss Fletcher would disappear into that darkness. But his feet and hers weren't moving. She tipped her face to him. Let me go. I'm not stopping you, he said. Her silver, spectral eyes beguiled him. He'd seen the color once in nature, north of the North Sea, where storm clouds sank into the water. Deep mysteries lived there. So did elusive creatures barely known to man. The same could be said of the dark-haired siren from Scotland. Standing with her was a taste of the exquisite, an unseen tether binding them. Night blurred a serene watercolor. Neither wanted this to end. He knew that. Miss Fletcher did too, clutching the bow under her chin, a sable curl floating free. The moment ripe for a kiss. Except they were on the doorstep of a brothel where men paid easy quid for a great deal more. What irony this was, him working hard for a kiss that would not happen. Please, go inside, she said, as though she needed him to walk away. Despite the cold, damp air, he was stubborn. Give me your right hand. She balked. Bewildered, Miss Fletcher offered him her ungloved appendage. Water dripping down his cheeks, he folded his hands around her work-worn hand. Racked with something more powerful than lust, he caressed her palm. Crystalline droplets anointed her hood, drawing the eye to her beautiful face. But Miss Fletcher's hands were her story. Her fingers where he touched, the small white scars which he traced, and the tip of her middle finger stained green from a brass thimble, which he kissed tenderly, sweetly. Her lips parted on a fragile gasp. The sound rang inside him. Laborers at Highland Great Wet Dock would box a man's ears for attaching tender and sweet to anything he did, but it was the truth, and the innocent kiss worth it. She had amused, enlightened, irked, and insulted, and surprised him all in 1 hour. What would happen if she gave him the night? Possibly heaving breaths, hot kisses, and lively conversation with the too smart for her own good corset maker. He'd have her spouting poetry. Shite, he'd spout some too. But tonight he would let her go. Good night, Miss Fletcher. His voice rumbled in the dark. She hid her hand in velvet folds. Good night, Mr. West. Despite the Herculean resistance inside him, he forced himself to walk back inside as requested. What he did next was a secret between him and those smiling frescoes.
Sure. I wanted to read today from The Forger and the Duke. This one just came out in March, and it is set in Cornwall. It begins in Cornwall, but mostly set in 1776 London. It features, the part I'm going to read features Malden Gray, who is aspiring to the bar and is the bastard son of the former Duke of Hunsdon. He is trying to get guardianship of his 3 young wards, his younger half-siblings, and he's being fought on this in the court by the Duchess, who he thinks is supposed to be taking care of the children, but she just cleaned out the coffers of the estate and left for the continent with the steward. He's recently found this out. He goes in search of the children, cannot find them, finally locates them outside of the house that he doesn't recognize. So he storms in and he sees a woman feeding them cakes and tea and accuses her of kidnapping. which isn't actually what happened. The children have gone in search of their tutor, Joseph Illingworth, trying to seek his help. He wasn't home, but his sister, Amaranthe, who is a copyist, is. She's working on her latest commission. She welcomes the children in, she feeds them, and when Mal sees this happening, he asks her to come back to Hunsdon House to help him sort out the disarray that the house is in right now because he has no idea what he's doing, and she seems like a very capable sort of young woman. So I thought the scene I would read is after the dinner and the children have somewhat introduced themselves, then Mal and Amaranth are in the old Duke's study having a conversation about how to fix all of this. Shall I begin?
Yes, take it away.
All right, the Forger and the Duke. If anyone wants to follow along at home, I'm on page 71. My brother Joseph can make the necessary arrangements. I cannot think you welcome me poking my nose in your business, Amaranth said. Truth, he wanted her nose in every other part of her in his business. No. Mal struggled to cut through the haze clouding his thoughts. No, he did not want her prying into his affairs, as attractive as her nose was. Your brother does not seem to have been aware of what was going on here any more than I was, Mal managed to point out. A small line appeared between her deep-set, altogether too perceptive eyes. She pressed her hands together as if she were a medieval nun at prayer. Things have been deteriorating for quite some time, from what Ralph could tell me. I cannot say how long it's been since the children had a proper meal. Their nurse left days ago, yet my brother noticed nothing. The boys would have had too much pride to tell him anything was wrong, Mal said. A new, heavy weight on his chest pressed close those snaking tendrils of desire, putting them back in their proper place. Ever since their father died. He studied the amber liquid in his glass, avoiding her gaze. I suspect things have been deteriorating at least since then. Sybil would have had nothing but contempt or neglect for them until she saw Hugh's inheritance as a way to enrich herself, and when she set herself against me, she restricted my access to the house and to them, which is why I had no notion she'd abandoned them to the servants, and the servants had abandoned them as well. Mel looked at her in appeal. She couldn't blame him any more than he blamed himself. He'd gotten so caught up in his own concerns that he neglected to look in on the children he meant to make his wards, children who shared his blood. He saw no contempt in her expression, only a look of puzzlement as she studied his features. He was your father, too, she observed. You must feel his loss in some way. Mel upended the last of his brandy. I feel the loss of his attempting to make up for the circumstances of my birth with his money, he said shortly. His passing brought a period to a bitter life that in the end descended to madness. It was a relief, if you must know. He was never a happy man. He told me once, in a maudlin fit, that my mother was the only person he ever loved, and when his father forced them apart, his life held no real satisfaction for him thereafter. That is a heavy burden for him to lay upon you, she said quietly. Mel stared at the leather surface of the table, marked with small cuts and tobacco stains. Miss Illingworth was alarmingly easy to confide in. No wonder the children had unburdened themselves to her at once, when they came to enlist the aid of her brother and found him not at home. And why had they not come to Mal? That omission stung more than being left without the funds to support them, or himself. She picked up a small portrait that sat on a delicate table placed between two chairs. The face of a hauntingly lovely woman with delicate features and clouds of hair stared distantly from the frame. Mal stared back. His mother had always been half angel to him, fragile and luminous from the illness that eventually claimed her life. All the times his father had called him into this study for a raking over about his wild ways and unknown future, Mal had never seen the sketch. He wondered who had done it, and when. Was this her? Amaranthe asked. I see a resemblance. Yes, that was my mother, Marguerite. She startled and nearly dropped the silver frame. Her fingers were graceful but strong, like the rest of her, with ink staining the tips and a streak of gold along her thumb. Was she as styled herself Lady Verney by any chance? A light blush touched her cheek as he stared at her. I came across a book once with the name Marguerite Lady Verney inscribed in it, and I was curious about her. I'm sorry to pry. Where did you find this book? It was an old manuscript in my place I lived for a time, in Cornwall. I don't know where it is now. Her eyes fell, but not before he glimpsed the shadow that crossed her expression. So many things she was hiding from him, but he was caught in the sweep of her eyelashes as she studied the table. Miss Illingworth had the same subtle, ethereal beauty that his mother had possessed. Not the kind of assertive handsomeness that announced itself, or the kind of astonishing beauty that smacked a man across the face. Rather, she was a small, willowy shadow that stepped into a man's fractured world, and by the time she came into focus, she had somehow, magically, made everything right and calm and beautiful. It's possible your book was her. She was mad about old things. Mel took a bracing swig that emptied his glass again. I suppose my mother might have used the title. She always insisted my father had wed her properly, but of course he would have said anything to win her. No record of a legal marriage, though. My grandfather claimed that my father deceived her, and I've never doubted that he did. Mel debated whether to refresh his glass. The brandy was fuzzing his perceptions, making him think imprudent things about Miss Illingworth. Enchanting, indeed, when she sat across from him as prim and proper as a governess. He'd best get a grip on these galloping fancies. There was no self hidden beneath that drab, worn gown, no passionate heart subdued by the constraints of her station, just waiting to be awakened by a kiss. And if there were, he had no business knowing such things about her, not when he had so little to offer her in return. When my father married Christine, she became Lady Verney for a short time. Mel moved his mind back to the matter at hand. My grandfather didn't live long after the wedding, from what I understand. It was the aim of his life to ensure his heir married into a family of suitable wealth and station, and he achieved it. She set the portrait gently in its place. Mel battled the impulse to take those cool, capable fingers and press them against his aching head. And where's your mother now? She died when I was young. Dear Lord, he was becoming sentimental. He pushed the weakness aside. You're coming to know a great deal about us, Miss Illingworth, and I know very little about you. Her eyes crinkled as she smiled widely, and Mel cast about for breath. We have not even been properly introduced. Malden Gray of Bristol, aspiring to the bar. He held out his hand. Malden, she said, and a silken quality in her voice made him shudder, as did the slide of her fingers as she placed them in his. There's an Anglo-Saxon poem about a battle at an English ford called Malden. One of those manuscripts sadly lost in the Cotton Fire, actually. You haven't told me your name. Miss Amaranthe Illingworth of St. Clair, Cornwall. Copyist. My father was very fond of classical antiquity, so he chose a Greek name for me. He gave my mother the honor of naming my brother. Joseph, Mel said, a Hebrew name, very different tradition. My mother's family were Portuguese conversos. She withdrew her hand. Jews who converted to Christianity so they might escape the Inquisition with their businesses and their lives. They practiced in secret for centuries, or so I've been told, but in the end my mother converted in truth and married a man bound for the Anglican Church. She held the housekeeper's volume close to her chest like a shield. He sat back. The confidence stunned him. She'd learned he was a bastard, the status he wore like a brand on his forehead, marking him as deficient. But if her family had been Jewish, then she knew something as well about being set apart. She rose and he scrambled to his feet. Very neatly she placed her glass on the shelf beneath the decanter. Her eyes traced the figurines above, all of them representing mythological half-women with breasts prominently displayed. They are not mine, Mal said. That small, maddening smile quirked her lips again. No, they are young Hunsdon's now, I imagine. I've seen this and worse among some of the medieval marginalia I've copied, Mr. Gray. You wouldn't believe some of the grotesques those monks could dream up. I suppose it comes from being locked away day after day with no company but other men. That was his problem as well, Mal decided. Too much time in the company of other men. That was why she'd riled his senses so potently. He moved around the table toward her as she stepped away. I could drive you tomorrow to the orphan place with the distressed women. Again the dance of those interesting brows. You sound terrified at the very thought of confronting those in distress, yet as a barrister I imagine you frequently encounter persons in unfortunate circumstances. Prospective barrister. I'm waiting to be called to the bar. He hated appearing so helpless, so insufficient around her. A woman could not desire a man she pitied. What time shall I bring the carriage round? She hesitated, and her face went studiously blank. A slither across the back of his neck told him this was the expression she wore when she was withholding something. He was beginning to recognize it. Edie made up a room for me here, she said. Do you mind? Of course not. There are dozens of rooms. Or so he thought. Hunsdon House was not his, as nothing about the Hunsdon estate was to be his, not even the family name, and so he'd never let much of it occupy his attention. He wondered which room Miss Amaranthe Illingworth would select for her own. Did she see her silk-smooth skin as best set off by the draperies in the blue room? Would she choose the oriental patterns of the jade room? Or would she, like an empress of old, demand the royal purple? He imagined her nearby in the house, going about her nightly routine, taking down her hair, drawing off her prim robe, perhaps splashing water onto her face that would run down that softly stirred neck to the collarbones hidden beneath, and he'd best stop imagining Miss Illingworth at her ablutions. He was about to embarrass himself. Till tomorrow, then, Miss Illingworth. Had she said he could call her Amaranthe? He wanted to roll the name over his tongue. It was exotic, yet robust, a name with command and presence, much like the woman. Good Lord, that brandy has turned his wits. He was behaving like a moonstruck calf, no worse. Till tomorrow, she said softly, and her gaze held his. The flickering candlelight brought out violet shadows in her eyes, and all the air left Mal's body. He wanted to be found worthy of that calm, assessing gaze. There was no way she would ever find him worthy. The door shut behind her, and Mal smacked a hand to his head to clear it. He'd best bring himself in order. They had business to conduct, problems to solve. She had secrets he wanted very much to discover. He had gotten his first good look at Miss Amaranthe Illingworth. He wanted a second, and a third.
I hope you enjoyed these samples from Gina Conkle and Misty Urban. Make sure you subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler wherever you're listening or watching this so that you get fresh episodes in your inbox every week. We will be back with brand new episodes on August 7th with Elizabeth Everett, best-selling author, to kick things off. Until then, happy reading!